Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wheeler Centre and this week's Text and the City session on Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. My name is Lili Wilkinson. I'm a young adult author and academic, and talking to me this afternoon is Phil Zachariah. Phil is a graduate of the National Theatre with a background in science, theatre and education, and has worked in positions as varied as performing for the CSIRO Science Education Centre and singing in the Victorian State Opera. Please join me in making him welcome. Now, today is a hot Tuesday afternoon in March in Australia, which is probably about as far away as we could possibly get from Dickensian Christmas. So we're going to start by Phil is going to set the scene for us and perform a little bit of A Christmas Carol.
And this involves moving the mic, which is going to upset our lovely sound man enormously, but we have to do it. I take it you've all read it, so we will go to the early part where the story actually begins in Scrooge's office. Once upon a time, of all the good days of the year, upon a Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting, foggy weather. The door to the counting house was open that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond a sort of tank, was copying letters. Now, Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he could not replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, at which effort, not being a man of a strong imagination, he decidedly failed. "A Merry Christmas to you, Uncle! God save you!" It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who had come upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation Scrooge had had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug! Christmas, a humbug, Uncle. Oh, you don't mean that, I am sure." "I do. Merry Christmas. What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? Here, poor enough. Well then, what right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said "Bah!" again and followed it up with "Humbug! Don't be cross, Uncle. What else can I be when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas. Out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, and a time for finding yourself 1 year older and not an hour richer? If I had my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should. Uncle, nephew, keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine. Keep it? Oh, but you don't keep it. Let me leave it alone then. Much good may it do you. Much good it has ever done you. Oh, there are many things which might have done me good, by which I have not derived profit. I dare say Christmas among the rest. But I am sure that I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come around, as a good time. A kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the one time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to look upon those below them as if they really were fellow travellers to the grave and not some other race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good, and I say God bless it. The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Let me hear another sound from you and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir. I wonder you don't go into Parliament. Oh, don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow. Scrooge said that he would see him. Yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first. But why, Uncle? Why? I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends? Good afternoon. Oh, I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party, but I have made my trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humour to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, Uncle. Good afternoon, and a Happy New Year. Good afternoon. The nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding.
Thank you very much, Phil. That was excellent. So let's start with a little bit of background. Let's talk about why Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol. What was it that, that spurred him and inspired him to write this book?
Two things. One was that he needed an income, which is...
Inspires us all.
It does indeed. And it's not a bad thing in itself. The other thing is that he desperately wanted to change things in society. 1843 was the year he wrote it. He'd been down the tin mines in Cornwall and seen how badly the child miners were treated. I mean, little kids working in down the mine under appalling conditions. He went to the Ragged School at Fields Lane in London, where there were schools set aside for the children of the poorest of the poor so that they could learn some trade. It was so horrible there that his companion had to rush out of the place. The stench was so bad. Dickens stayed to see how it was run. He spoke on the stage of the Manchester Athenaeum with a bunch of people, including Benjamin Disraeli, who was later Prime Minister. There was a group of people called, I think, the Young Lions, whose aim was to improve working conditions in England, in Britain. And basically, Dickens was determined that to write a book that would persuade the employers, the factory owners, the managers, to be kinder to their workers, to give them... I mean, it's something that flowed on to their children, to their families, to the whole poor community. And that was sort of what he was heading for. And any of that you want me to spell? Writing like mad down the front.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here.
You go, Phil.
Because George Orwell, who was a big fan of Dickens, thought that in a lot of ways Dickens was not particularly empowering. That Dickens didn't empower its poor characters, and that it put all of the responsibility on fixing the system sort of onto these rich people. And he said, and I quote, "It seems that in every attack Dickens makes upon society, he is always pointing to a change in spirit rather than a change in structure."
Yes. Quite right. Yes, I think he felt that, I don't know how much of the structure he wanted to change. I'm just an actor. But if I was to suggest Dickens' response, it might be that you're not going to have a structural change until you have a change in people's attitude. They have to realise the change needs to be made. And that still applies today, people. So,
absolutely.
Yes. So you can't just force the change on society. People have to realise that a change is needed. And you had to persuade people that slavery was a bad thing before you could actually bring about the end of it.
Yep, excellent. So what is it like as an actor to perform Dickens, and what is it about Dickens that makes it so much more awesome when it's read aloud?
Because of the way he wrote, to answer the last part first, he wrote in such an incredibly colourful way that it is a wonderful thing to read aloud, and I recommend to everybody, whether it's Christmas Carol or some other book that he wrote, to read it out loud, to enjoy the characters, because he wrote wonderful characters, and it doesn't matter who you see perform it. You'll see that they start to do things with the characters, and you'll find yourselves starting to, the character will start to come through, because there was just something both larger than life and true to life about the characters and the situations. What is it like to perform this? It's a privilege. I come off stage at the end of every performance, and I think, am I a lucky boy or what? Because this is a wonderful story. I mean, I've done a lot of plays, I've done all sorts of things in my career, and it's some of them you can be, by the end of the second or third week, you're thinking, okay, what have you got next? I'm done with this. I've performed this 134 times, and it doesn't get stale for me. At the beginning of it, because I perform it as Dickens, hence. In the introduction, I use one of Dickens' lines when he said, not every performance, but he often said, in the reading of this little book, which I am to have the great pleasure of going through with you tonight. And contemporary writers at the time, people who wrote about his performances, said you could see that he loved the fact that he got to hear the story himself, that he got to tell it. And I feel the same way. I come out, I think, this is great. I get to hear the story again. I get to tell it again. I get to play those characters, and it's such a wonderful thing. I don't feel as though I'm sort of beating people over the head with this moralistic, you must change. I'm just telling a story that has some wonderful characters and some wonderful moments and some wonderful thoughts in it. And if people want to change, and I've had some very interesting reactions along those lines from audience members, people who have actually talked about how they were going to go out and do something different with their lives. I think that's the power of that story. There's something in it that gets to people.
It is a very powerful story, and even though we keep seeing it and hearing it kind of over and over again, and it's a story that sort of wormed its way into our sort of cultural consciousness. We use Scrooge as a noun, and it is a lot of the lines from it have sort of worked its way into our. It have become almost cliches in a lot of ways,
yes. But
it still remains a very powerful story. So you said before that the characters in Dickens, in particular in Christmas Carol, are both larger than life and also true to life. And I think this is a really great way to describe Scrooge, because there are a lot of things about Scrooge in the beginning of the book that could come across as being quite cliched or quite caricatured, because he's so cranky and so grumpy, but he always feels real. So let's talk about Scrooge. What is it about Scrooge that makes him such a real character?
Well, because he's not just some evil piece of, he's not an evil megalomaniac or anything like that. He's a real person who has suffered in his life. He had things happen early in his life which somehow soured him. He got caught up in the love of money, and some things happened to him which he put aside and tried not to remember, which, of course, the Ghost of Christmas Past shows him. And so you can see that it's a little bit of a there but for the grace of God go I. You can react in many different ways to the terrible things that happen. Something bad happens to you, you think, I'm just going to go out and be bad to people. Or you can think, well, maybe I'll make sure those bad things don't happen to other people. And there you have the two parts of Scrooge. You have the way Scrooge went, and later on when he's shown the error of his ways and he realises that life for everybody, including himself, is so much nicer if you're nice to people. And so all of us could make that same mistake.
And I think that change in Scrooge is one of the things that makes him really real as well, is that he doesn't just remain, a cranky old man, that he ends up with this incredible capacity for kindness and generosity. But certainly for me, one of the things I like the most about Scrooge is that he's funny. And, even from the very beginning, he's funny.
Yeah, he makes jokes all the time. And it's one of his ways of putting people down, squishing them, and and he says he tells the ghost of Marley that I don't believe you're a ghost. You're just an upset stomach. Just affecting me. And he says, there's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are.
That's one of my favourite bits.
It's great, isn't it? So he's a funny guy, and he's a three-dimensional guy, I think.
Let's go back to Gravy and of Grave, because I want to talk a little bit about food, because I think that, in rereading the book, food is one of the kind of...
We have food?
Yeah, I wish we had food. We should have a feast. Food is one of the things that really jumps out at you, that Dickens's incredible descriptions of food. He describes the grocer's shops with ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish fries, which, by the way, made me think that the Muppet version, where they have singing fruit, is actually totally legit. As well as all the descriptions of Fezziwig's ball and of Bob Cratchit's Christmas dinner, and particularly the description of the Christmas pudding that's all wrapped up in the cloth, and the way it smells and the way it's set alight. And I think that is incredible when contrasted to Scrooge's attitude towards food at the beginning. He's described as being as solitary as an oyster, and that
his usual melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern.
And he eats gruel for dinner, and he blames the ghost on being a crumb of undigested cheese. And what do you think that Dickens is trying to say about the role of food in not only just everyday life, but also in celebration?
Well, it's one of the pleasures of life, and it's just one more pleasure of life, I think, that Scrooge denies himself. It's one of the things I was thinking about the other day, actually, because my director and I... the show is directed by James Adler, and we're constantly, for nearly 10 years now, we've been revisiting it, and we constantly discuss it and what people's motivations are. And I was saying, I don't know what Scrooge has that he's ever actually gone out and bought, except perhaps the fine linen shirt, the shirt that is stolen from him after his future death, and then the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come shows him. The other things that are stolen, the brooch and what have you, he might have inherited those from Marley or from his father. And I thought about it. I can't imagine him actually going out and buying a piece of jewellery, because he just denies himself that pleasure. He doesn't even... if you get pleasure from jewellery, but he denies himself the pleasure of food, he denies himself the pleasure of company, music, social... everything. He just exists to make money, and probably the only other pleasure he gets is squishing people, just putting them back in their place and putting them down for stupid things like actually enjoying Christmas.
You mentioned music before, and I think that music is another really kind of important part in this story. Not only is the book obviously called A Christmas Carol, and the book is separated up into stanzas instead of into parts. But also it feels like in the book music becomes a really big trigger for Scrooge in terms of his memories. A lot of his memories involve music setting off.
Right. You're actually testing me a little, of course. Some of those parts have been edited out of the performance, because we have to cut it down. The first year we performed it was 2.5 hours long, and now I perform any of several lengths, including in Paris we had to be out of the theatre in an hour, so I did a 55-minute version, which was interesting.
Just cut one of the ghosts out, no one will know.
Oh, we actually made that joke, yeah. It's very interesting, because every time you have to cut it down you say, OK, I love all these. For example, after the first year, we cut out that grocer's scene that Lili was talking about. I love it. It's one of my favourite parts. It's prose poetry. Read that out loud. The grocer's shop is just brilliant. There's a rhythm and a magic to it. But what was I saying?
For music.
Music. Yes, what was I saying about the music?
That you've had to cut some of those.
So we had to cut some of it, yes. Well, there are some parts of it, such as the music at Fred's, and yes, I believe his niece by marriage sings a song that he remembers. Sadly, we don't have that in the performance. But yes, it certainly happens. And of course, there's the music at Fezziwig's, when Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig come out to dance Sir Roger de Coverley. In the performance, I actually sing that passage to the tune of Roger de Coverley.
Nice.
But yes, the music is a lovely thing. And again, of course, he denies it. He just says, it's pointless. It doesn't earn him money and it doesn't help him squish people, so he doesn't. Doesn't indulge. I hope this is helping.
Let's talk about Christmas for a bit, because one of the things that I didn't realise until sort of going through, I should say, by the way, I have this enormous annotated Christmas carol that I highly recommend you guys check out, because it is super annotated. It's got like a 200-page introduction, and it has all of the kind of historical detail and context and stuff that you would ever want to know. So, check it out. I'm sure your library will have it, and if not, ask them to get it for you. Anyway, when reading this, I discovered that one of the things I hadn't realised, and I'm a big fan of Christmas, I love Christmas, but I hadn't realised that really just before this period, people in England didn't really celebrate Christmas very much anymore, and that after the Puritan Reformation in the 1600s, there wasn't a whole lot of Christmas celebrating going around, because, the Puritans viewed Christmas to be very closely linked to Catholicism, and particularly Christmas celebrations and giving gifts and having feasts that they all saw as like basically just giving stuff to the Pope. And, they didn't think that was cool.
I think they didn't like dancing because you don't know what it might lead to.
Yeah, exactly. And clearly having fun and eating food and giving presents and dancing was just, going to have terrible consequences. So they didn't like doing it. And that a lot of people sort of credit Dickens with sort of resurrecting Christmas in the form that we know it, of eating the pudding and the turkey and singing songs. And most of the Christmas carols that I just assume were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old really only came around in sort of the mid-1850s. So I find this really, really interesting. What do you think Christmas means for Charles Dickens?
Ooh.
And why Christmas? Why did he choose Christmas to tell this story?
Right, the easy questions first.
Yeah,
Well, I know that he loved Christmas. He loved a good time. He loved a party. He was always the life of the party. He'd sweep people up to dance, and he'd love the games, the forfeits. I don't know what it meant to him personally. That's one thing I can't help you with. I think, one could even make the argument, and I'll get a little bit radical with you here now, one could make the argument that this is not a story about Christmas. That perhaps, I'm just throwing it out there, I'm not telling you, that perhaps Christmas is just a device for saying, be nice to people. And Christmas is a very useful device for that, because the message of Christmas is about being nice to people. And I think perhaps that might be what Dickens especially enjoyed. I mean, he enjoyed the food. He loved having the food and the parties and the whole thing. But that was an expression of good times. And
yeah, I think you're probably right. And I think that it's very telling that the book is not a religious book in any way, that none of the sort of religious parts of Christmas are really experienced or discussed. They don't talk about going to church. There are ghosts and where they could have been.
There's a couple of mentions.
Yeah. But yeah, we have ghosts where he could easily have written angels or, some sort of more religious vision. But he very consciously, it seems, didn't want to do that. I think possibly because he wanted to make it more about sort of individual generosity, perhaps, instead of oblige and obligation.
Yes, I mean, there are, I think, one or two oblique references to Jesus, and there's that interesting passage, again, not in the performance, where Scrooge criticises the Ghost of Christmas Present for squishing people's pleasure by not allowing them to do certain things on a Sunday or on a Christmas day. And he says, why blame me? I didn't do it. People did it. People made the laws. People made the regulations. And that's Dickens having a quiet little dig saying, we should have more fun and, don't be so... Why should Sunday be so dull?
Yeah. So one of the things I noticed when reading this book, as I tend to occasionally do, is that there's not a whole lot of ladies in A Christmas Carol, but there are a few. And when I started to think about what kind of role women might play in the book, the first thing I thought about were those horrible women who, are stealing all of his stuff after he is dead, after the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come shows him that particular vision. But then I realised that probably the more important female characters in the book are Scrooge's sister and Scrooge's fiancée, Belle. And I started to think that you could, and this is just like my brain going a little bit strange, but I wonder if a possible reading for the book could be that because Scrooge turns away from those women in his youth, and he's in some ways kind of like rejecting his own sort of femininity and his own feminine side, and that by doing so, in order to kind of to redeem himself and to become a whole person again, he has to embrace that, and he does that through nurturing and feeding the Cratchits. What do you reckon?
Ooh, that's something a poor little simple actor doesn't think of.
Just throwing it out.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lily. You could have warned me. Possible, very possible, interesting. The little sister Fan, perhaps she's Dickens' own little sister because his sister was named Fan. And there's a significance of him losing a fiancée named Belle at Christmas time. And there's the bell upstairs that Scrooge hears just before Marley turns up, which is, again, not in the performance now, but never mind. We're not talking about my performance, we're talking about the book. Look, that's a very interesting thought about the whole feminine nurturing side of it. It's very, very possible. I mean, one could also argue about the two women, the charwoman and the laundress who steal from him. I mean, there's also an undertaker's assistant who steals from the dead Scrooge. And they're simply because they're people who had access to his house. The chars were female, the laundresses were female. So it's a sort of a coincidental thing, that's not as though he was trying to say, look, women are terrible and they steal from dead bodies. But that's rather nice. And by the way, if I may also just chuck in here that when we do Q&As after performances at schools, one of the things the director likes to point out is that he says there are no right answers. He said, what is important is how you argue your point. So don't take any of what we're saying as the absolute truth. It's just there to suggest ideas and to get you looking at different aspects. Which is the great thing about literature. Yeah. So we could talk about this all day. I have so many notes that we just won't have time to get to. But what are sort of the moments in this story that really stand out for you? I love Marley turning up. Gosh, he's pretty freaky. And he's the first thing that sort of impinges on Scrooge. I love Fan. Fan is so excitable and also, of course, leads into the schoolmaster, who's a bit of fun too. Fezziwig. My director points out that sometimes if my performance isn't perhaps quite as lifted as it is at other times, by the time I get to Fezziwig, I'm bouncing along because Fezziwig is so much fun. I have to dance all over that stage and have a good time. And Fezziwig, and that's the thing that gets to the Scrooge. Scrooge is being reminded of what it is to have a good time, and that's one of the things. The Cratchits, how could you not love the Cratchits? Cratchits. They're miserably poor. They're having a great time and they're still enjoying each other. And they're real people, because she starts moaning and, snarling about Scrooge. And he's like, it's Christmas Day. And so they're lovely people. And then Scrooge is redeemed. He gets to dance about and holler and laugh and wish people Merry Christmas and send turkeys, and it's fun. It's actually fun. I mean, I having to play a pinched, curled up sort of Scrooge all the time, and then suddenly I can, excuse me, sorry, and then I can have fun, and you can, hello, hello. And the bells ring and clash, clang, hammer, ding, dong, bell, bell, dong, ding, hammer, clang, clash, glorious, glorious. And then he calls the boy and says, what's today? And the boy says, what? What's today? He says, Christmas Day. It's Christmas. I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. Oh, they can do anything they like. Of course they can. Of course they can. Hello. My fine fellow. Hello? Yeah. So, yeah, that's fun.
That is definitely fun. All right, I think on that note we might throw open to questions. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, up the back, or in the middle back there.
I was just wondering who the publisher is of your annotated edition that you have.
Good question. Norton.
Thank you. And
worries.
second question is, could you possibly talk a bit about the appearance of ignorance and want?
Yeah, that was one of my notes that I had, because I personally don't particularly like the appearance of ignorance and want.
Don't like ignorance and want. Well, I do actually. I know it's described by some commentators as being a little clumsy, it's unsubtle. But I think Dickens is making the very good point that if you don't educate people, if you leave them wanting, then you're just going to have trouble. He says, he brings, you know the part we're talking about? You remember the bit where, at the very end of The Ghost of Christmas Present, when they're in the open place and the ghost brings forth, from under his robe, he brings forth two children, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish. Spirit, are they yours? They are man's. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both and all of their degree. Have they no refuge or resource? Are there no prisons? Said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are there no workhouses? So it's Dickens saying, don't blame them if there's crime about, if you have to, look over your shoulder walking down the street. Ask yourself if you have any responsibility for those people being poor and ignorant and in need of going out and stealing or causing some sort of trouble. The more education, the more people have a comfortable life, the better it is for all of society and the better it is for you. And I like it. I like the fact that he's put that in, that this big jolly ghost who so far has been all about, let's have a good time and look at this, isn't that fantastic? People are enjoying themselves, they're having a great time here, and he says these people are not having a great time. What are they going to do? What are they going to do to have a great time? What are they going to do to eat to survive? Do you have a responsibility for that? Send them to prison, send them to workhouse? And he's saying we're all responsible. Every part of society affects every other part. That's my interpretation anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a good point. I'm just not convinced he hasn't already made that point elsewhere in the story. And I feel like it is a little soapboxy, and I feel like he sort of takes off his storyteller's hat and puts on, a social reformer hat instead. And so for me it is a little clumsy in a storytelling sense.
Okay, possibly, sure. But one of the interesting things about it too, if I just throw in very quickly with that, is that you may notice that the narrators... This is one of the things that makes it such a lovely story to tell as in a play form, because the narrator's voice is there the whole time. He keeps coming back and saying, well, this happened, now, well, I don't know about you, but I think that... And he just keeps... And so he's actually there the whole time telling you the story. He's not just writing out. It's not, total third person removed from him. The author is actually there with you, guiding it through. And so I think for him to say... So it doesn't bother me for him to say, in case you haven't quite worked it out... Listen to what I'm telling you. I'm happy with that.
Any other questions? Yep, this one down here.
I noticed in your monologue...
Just wait for the thing. Sorry. We're recording it, so...
I noticed when you were doing Fred's monologue, I will enjoy Christmas, you talk about fellow travellers to the grave. Our text actually says fellow passengers, and I believe that was an alteration that Dickens made himself when he was reading it aloud. And do you not think that perhaps that notion of disempowering the poor, like there's a difference between being a traveller and a passenger, isn't there? So that Dickens's later revision, do you think, of trying to empower them or equalise the balance a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. He made a lot of changes like that. Quite a few words, just subtle little words, were changed along the way, but he definitely decided that was a much better idea, that they were also going somewhere with you rather than being taken along. Because, I don't know, I would take a stab at that, at saying that perhaps there was a sense among the more privileged members of society that they were actually society and the poor were just there to do the hard work and the grubby work.
And also, because I think early on Scrooge is a bit of a passenger with the spirits until he has to become more active with the third spirit.
Oh, nice.
Very nice.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think that Scrooge is very passive in everything, really, at the beginning, that he, as you were saying, that he sort of excluded himself from participating in anything, and that he is very much a passenger to the grave. He's just kind of hanging on till he dies, really. And that one of the things he has to do is become a more active participant in life.
Yeah. It's a bit of the be my brother's keeper type of thing, perhaps, but yeah, definitely.
Other questions? Up the very back. It's a long way to go with that microphone.
There's also another word that he put into that speech, by the way, while we're just getting up there. If you just see in a second, he says, it slipped from my mind. Never mind, you go and find it.
I was just wondering, how do you reckon Dickens uses the physical environments, like the weather, to portray his ideas?
The weather, yes. Yes, it's interesting that he... Well, of course, Christmas being at winter time and bitterly cold most of the time, it's very interesting to make that connection and to use that cold, the cold comparison with the way Scrooge behaved. Interestingly, there has been... This is very slight sidebar, I'll get to it very quickly. There has actually been research looking at the fact that the same parts of our brain deal with both physical cold and emotional cold, called the insular cortex. It's not going to help your essays at all, but it's interesting. It's almost a synesthesia thing, an idea of comparing those. Scrooge is described as being very cold. He said, no warmth could warm, no cold could chill him, no wind that blew was bitterer than he, no falling snow more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. So it's an absolute gift for you. If Christmas had been in the summertime, he would have been struggling to describe Scrooge, I think.
And definitely that scene at the beginning where poor Bob Cratchit is trying to warm himself by the light of one candle and failing. And, yeah, definitely. And then sort of the transformation into warmth as we sort of move later on into the story.
Yes, and when he throws open his window, when he's redeemed the, clear, bright, stirring, golden day. So it has to be warm. Notice, too, he describes the two churchyards. I find it very interesting that in the future section, Tiny Tim is buried, he's going to be buried in the graveyard, and Bob says, I wish you could have seen it, my dear. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But when Scrooge finds where he's going to be buried, it was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun with grass and weeds, a growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying fat with repleted appetite. So that's got things growing there too, but they're weeds there. It's unpleasant, and it sort of goes to the weather thing, He sets his scene very, very well. It perhaps, you might say it's a little unsubtle in some ways, but it leaves you in no doubt what he's telling you about the scene and about the character. And it is true. If you're in a good mood, you can go jumping around in the snow and you don't particularly mind that it's cold. But if you're in a lousy mood, you're going to feel that cold.
Great. Any other questions? Down the front.
Oh, here's trouble.
How do you think A Christmas Carol is ultimately a story of redemption?
Sounds like an essay question.
How do I think of that? Well, so I told you it'd be trouble. Yeah. Have a security. When I use the word redemption, I'm not talking in a religious sense. I'm talking about the fact that he is redeemed from being a nasty, crabby, horrible, miserable lump of a man to somebody who's actually alive, who's living, and that is a redemption. That's not a I'm going to heaven now, although that's sort of implied, but it's not important. The religious side of it, the afterlife side of it. He's missed out on going around with the chains and that's not even a religious thing. That's just this strange sort of interesting mystical universe that Dickens has created. That if you're bad, you get to drag around chains and see all the things that you would like to help now that you should have helped in life, but you can't do anything about anymore, and that is a torment. For you. That is the sort of the torment of hell. You cannot now fix the things that you should have fixed when you were alive. So his redemption is to be able to fix those things, to still be alive and to be able to fix those things and to make the world better around him.
I think that in most literature, I'm hesitant to say all literature, but certainly most literature is generally about a main character changing. And a lot of people have often sort of pointed out is Bob Cratchit supposed to be the main character of this story? And in sort of theatrical performances, sometimes he is. And, I read that they often give the highest, the most prestigious actor plays Bob Cratchit and not Scrooge.
The tenor,
But the reason why it is Scrooge's story and not Bob Cratchit's story is that Bob Cratchit doesn't change, that his circumstances change. Like he, goes from being very, very poor to a little bit more comfortable. But he starts off a really good, nice person and he ends a really good, nice person, whereas Scrooge undergoes such a great change. And that change happens because he is offered a choice. He is offered the choice of, do you want to stay like this, which you can do, but this is going to be the consequences, or, do you want to become a decent human being? And that he takes up that challenge. And I think that, all great stories, all sort of great protagonists are offered that choice of an easy way out or a difficult path which will have greater rewards.
Yes. I mean, Bob is an example to Scrooge. You have nothing, but you're still happy. And Scrooge takes that example. That's how important Bob is to him, but it is still very much about Scrooge. Yeah.
All right, we've got one last question. Yep.
Sorry, it's me again. Do you think Fred, though, is the man Scrooge could have been? Like he is, when he looks and he goes back and he sees Fan and he likes all that he sees, and he reflects on Fred, and Fred could really have been that. I mean, Fred's his nephew.
Oh, Fred is very important.
Fred,
yes.
So, I mean, Bob's lovely, but I actually think Bob's simplistic almost. Like, they say he's a man of little imagination in the beginning, whereas I think Fred is who Scrooge could have been. Like, he looks and he might admire things in him. I mean, he is also a touch one-dimensional maybe, but closer perhaps to who Scrooge could have been than...
Sure.
Because he's the genteel poor.
Well, they have different approaches. I mean, as I was saying, Bob is
lovely.
He's lovely. He doesn't have much, but he still knows how to be happy, and he's still generous of spirit. He's still generous towards Scrooge for all that Scrooge has done to him, and so is Fred. They're both generous towards him. They demonstrate no bad feeling. And so they both demonstrate. They're both models for behaviour for Scrooge. He sees from both of them. Yeah, Fred is very important, but it's sort of how you might be an example, depending on which strata of society, what level of education you have. It's a little bit of a class thing in this, but yes, Fred is a... Is he one-dimensional? Well, I suppose my challenge is to play him as multi-dimensional, but yeah. Yes, I like Fred too. Fred is fun. And you may notice too, he has that family sense of humour. He has the jokes in him here that Scrooge does, but they're not nasty jokes, they're nice jokes. He has a little bit of a dig at Topper and, people.
And yeah, I think you're right. I think that Fred, probably does represent what Scrooge could have been if Scrooge hadn't become such a Scrooge. But I suppose that the reason why people sort of hold Bob Cratchit up as sort of a paragon of virtue is because he has so little, but sort of makes so much of it, whereas Fred does not seem to have gone through as much of a struggle in his life.
No, I mean, Scrooge says you're poor enough, but clearly he's
not as poor as the Cratchits.
Yes, he hasn't got the backside out of his pants.
Yeah. All right, that is all we have time for, unfortunately. No. So please join me in thanking Phil.
Thank you.
And thank you guys very much for coming.